Hemophilia B. Queen Victoria ruled over the largest empire in human history and inadvertently planted a genetic time bomb inside the bloodlines of nearly every royal family in Europe. The disease was Hemophilia B, a deficiency of factor IX, the protein that allows blood to clot properly. Without it, a bruise doesn't fade, it deepens. A joint bleed doesn't stop, it swells until the joint is destroyed. A minor fall doesn't heal, it kills. Victoria was almost certainly a spontaneous carrier, meaning the mutation likely arose in her own DNA rather than being inherited, which is a bitter irony given what came next, because while inbreeding didn't create the mutation, it guaranteed the mutation spread. Victoria had 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and the determined habit of marrying them to each other and to cousins across the crowned heads of Europe. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, suffered from the disease his entire life and died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage triggered by a minor fall. Her daughters Beatrice and Alice carried the gene without being affected and passed it quietly into the German, Spanish, and Russian royal lines. The most catastrophic destination was Russia, where Alice's daughter Alexandra married Tsar Nicholas II and gave birth to Alexei Romanov in 1904. The long-awaited heir to the Russian throne and a boy who spent much of his childhood screaming, his joints filled with blood after ordinary childhood bumps, his knees swelled to the size of cantaloupes. Alexandra's desperation to save her son led her to Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose ability to calm Alexei's episodes gave him a political foothold in the Russian court that destabilized the entire empire in the years leading to 1917. A 2009 genetic analysis of the Romanov remains confirmed the specific mutation as Hemophilia B. The disease that started with a single mutation in one woman's DNA ended with a dynasty's collapse, a mystic's political ascent, and the execution of a family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Porphyria. King George III of Britain ruled for 60 years, lost the American colonies, and spent the final decade of his life blind, deaf, and confined to Windsor Castle, wandering the halls in a purple-trimmed dressing gown, talking to people who weren't there. The suspected cause is porphyria, a group of metabolic disorders affecting the production of heme, the compound that gives blood its red color. When heme production breaks down, toxic intermediates accumulate in the body, attacking the nervous system and producing a cascade that looks, to everyone watching, exactly like madness. George III experienced at least 4 major documented episodes of acute illness across his reign, characterized by severe abdominal cramping, muscle weakness, racing pulse, rambling incoherent speech, and the detail that contemporaries found most disturbing, his urine turned a dark port wine purple. During his worst episodes, he failed to recognize family members, made inappropriate sexual remarks to ladies of the court, and once attempted to dash the Prince of Wales's head against a wall. His doctors, working with 18th-century tools, responded with bleeding, blistering, and physical restraint, treatments that almost certainly made the neurological symptoms worse. The Regency Act of 1811 transferred governing power to the future George IV on the grounds of his father's incapacity, meaning a metabolic enzyme defect effectively rewrote British constitutional law. The porphyria diagnosis, first formally proposed in 1966, is not universally accepted. Some researchers argue bipolar disorder or arsenic poisoning from his own medications better explains the pattern, and a 2011 re-examination of hair samples did find elevated arsenic levels, but the hereditary pattern across multiple generations of the same inbred line remains difficult to explain away. The Habsburg jaw. No family in European history made inbreeding into a political strategy as systematically or as visibly as the Habsburgs, and no family paid for it as obviously. The dynasty's defining physical feature, a protruding lower jaw so severe that the lower teeth sat entirely in front of the upper teeth, appeared mildly in Philip I of Castile in the late 1400s and worsened with every subsequent generation of cousin marriage until it reached its terminal expression in Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, whose jaw was pronounced that he could not close his mouth, could barely chew food, and drooled constantly. A landmark 2019 study analyzed portraits and historical records of 66 Habsburg individuals across 11 generations, directly correlating the severity of jaw deformity with each individual's calculated coefficient of inbreeding. The correlation was nearly perfect. The more inbred the individual, the worse the jaw. The deformity is caused by recessive genetic variants that, in a normally diverse population, would almost never meet in the same individual. But the Habsburgs didn't marry a normally diverse population. They married each other. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins, generation after generation, because every marriage outside the dynasty risked diluting the concentration of power. land and title that the family had spent centuries accumulating. By the time Charles II wore the Spanish crown, he represented 11 generations of concentrated inbreeding, with a personal inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than the theoretical value for a child born of full siblings, intellectual disability, and developmental delay. Charles II of Spain is the most extreme documented case of inbreeding-caused developmental impairment in any ruling monarch in recorded history. The jaw was actually the least of his problems. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't speak clearly until he was 10. Even as an adult, his speech was so impaired by his jaw deformity and what appears to have been global developmental delay that foreign ambassadors stationed in Madrid reported struggling to understand him. One French ambassador wrote that Charles appeared to be always dying. Real power throughout his reign rested with court factions, religious advisors, and his mother Mariana of Austria. He suffered epileptic episodes. He experienced hallucinations serious enough that the church was brought in to perform exorcisms. His own court genuinely debated whether he was demonically possessed, which tells you everything about the gap between the supernatural explanations available to a 17th century court and genetic reality nobody had the framework to understand. He married twice and produced no children from either marriage, likely due to infertility caused by the same hormonal and developmental abnormality affecting every other system in his body. A contemporary autopsy account described his internal organs as in a state of extraordinary deterioration: a shrunken heart, rotten intestines, a brain reportedly filled with water. He died in 1700 at 38, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely, and his death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped European borders and killed hundreds of thousands of people. Cleft palate. The Habsburg jaw gets the fame, but cleft palate ran quietly through the same craniofacial developmental system, appearing across both the Habsburg dynasty and centuries earlier the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 305 BC to 30 BC, and practiced sibling marriage as deliberate divine policy for most of that period. Facial abnormalities including features consistent with cleft palate appear in coinage and written descriptions of several rulers. The mechanism is clear. The Ptolemaic policy of brother-sister marriage, maintained on the theological grounds that they were living gods whose divine bloodline must not be contaminated with mortal genetics, drove their genome toward the same endpoint every inbred animal population reaches when left to itself long enough: the surface expression of harmful recessive variants. Cleft palate before modern surgery wasn't merely cosmetic. In infancy, it made feeding nearly impossible. Infants with an unrepaired cleft cannot create the suction needed to nurse, meaning survival depended entirely on wet nurses using specialized feeding methods, and infant mortality was dramatically elevated. Survivors faced chronic ear infections, significant speech impediments, and a lifetime of social visibility in courts, where physical perfection was considered a divine endorsement of royal legitimacy. Epilepsy. The Ptolemaic dynasty didn't just produce structural deformities, it produced neurological instability as well. Ptolemy X and Ptolemy XII, the latter being Cleopatra VII's father, are among those whose described episodes, sudden collapses, convulsive episodes, periods of apparent unconsciousness followed by confusion, align with descriptions of generalized epilepsy. Certain forms of epilepsy have strongly recessive genetic components, meaning sibling marriage, the Ptolemaic standard from Ptolemy II Philadelphus onward, would have dramatically elevated the probability of a child inheriting two copies of defective neurological variants. What makes these cases historically interesting is the cultural translation layer. In the ancient world, a ruler who collapsed in a seizure didn't necessarily lose political authority. They might gain it. Epilepsy in Greek and Egyptian tradition carried associations with divine possession and sacred contact with the gods. A king who fell to the ground shaking during a public ceremony might have his episode immediately reframed by priests as divine ecstasy. This reframing was politically useful in the short term and medically catastrophic in the long term, because it meant the actual neurological crisis went unaddressed, while the dynasty continued the marriage practices generating it. Mental illness and depression. Juana I of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the mother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the legal queen of the most powerful empire in 16th century Europe. She was also a prisoner for 46 years. When her husband Philip the Handsome died suddenly in 1506, Juana's grief reportedly became something that alarmed her court. She refused to allow his coffin to be sealed and buried, allegedly keeping it with her and, in some accounts, opening it to be near his remains. Her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles both had compelling reasons to keep Juana classified as mentally incapable of ruling. She was the legitimate queen, and as long as she was sane, they were governing in her name without her consent. She was confined at the castle of Tordesillas in 1509 and did not leave until her death in 1555, a period of 46 years during which the empire she legally owned was ruled by the men who kept her locked up. Whether Juana suffered from a genuine psychiatric condition or whether her madness was primarily a political construction, amplified by those who benefited from her incapacity, remains unresolved. What is clearer is the genetic context. Juana was the product of a dynasty already accumulating recessive load through cousin marriage, and her own children and grandchildren would continue the pattern that eventually produced Charles II a century later: stillbirth and infant mortality. Queen Anne of Britain holds a record that no monarch in European history has come close to matching, and it is not a record anyone would want. She was pregnant at least 17 times and did not produce a single child who survived to adulthood. Most pregnancies ended in stillbirth. Several children died within hours or days of birth. One daughter lived to 2 months. Her one child who reached childhood, William Duke of Gloucester, was born in 1689 with an abnormally large head consistent with hydrocephalus, suffered through a childhood of chronic illness, and died in 1700 at the age of 11. Anne's reproductive history is so extreme that it defies explanation by random misfortune alone. Researchers have retrospectively proposed antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune clotting disorder with a genetic component that causes the body to attack the placenta, as a possible explanation. Anne was the product of the Stuart royal line, a family with documented inbreeding across multiple generations. She aged rapidly through repeated pregnancies and losses, becoming increasingly reclusive and physically deteriorated through her reign. She died in 1714 at 49, in visible physical ruin, having outlived every single one of her children. The political consequence of her empty nursery was that the Act of Settlement of 1701 had already redirected the British succession to the House of Hanover, the same line that would later produce George III and his Porphyria. Dwarfism and growth disorders. The Spanish Habsburg court of the 17th century is one of the most extensively documented royal courts in history, partly because Diego Velázquez spent decades painting it with meticulous precision, and what those paintings record is a court populated with individuals whose physical dimensions diverged sharply from expected norms. Court dwarfs appear in multiple Velázquez canvases, most famously Las Meninas of 1656. Some court dwarfs of this period were unrelated individuals employed in court service, a common European practice. But the frequency with which growth abnormalities and developmental delays appeared across the Habsburg family itself, in individuals who were not employed entertainers but blood relatives, reflects the same recessive genetic accumulation producing the jaw deformities and the cognitive impairments in the same bodies. Multiple forms of dwarfism follow recessive inheritance patterns. In a family where parents are themselves related, the probability that both carry the same variant rises dramatically with each generation of close relative marriage. The tragic footnote is that the court's practice of surrounding the royal family with individuals who had the same conditions the royal family was developing in itself created a kind of visual normalization. The genetic consequences of inbreeding became part of the court's aesthetic furniture rather than a warning anyone was equipped to read. Hereditary deafness. Hereditary deafness is genetically one of the most complex sensory disorders known. Over 100 genes have been identified as contributing to various forms of inherited hearing loss, but many of the most common forms follow recessive inheritance patterns. In a population practicing sustained cousin marriage, the mathematical probability of 2 carriers reproducing rises sharply with each generation, because the carrier frequency within the bloodline is not randomly distributed. The Medici family of Florence, technically a mercantile dynasty rather than a royal one, but wielding equivalent political power and practicing cousin marriage extensively to consolidate wealth and influence, documented hearing loss across several family members in ways that historians have noted but rarely analyzed through the genetic framework the pattern deserves. A ruler with significant hearing loss in a court structured entirely around spoken communication was functionally impaired in ways that advisors and enemies could and did exploit. The accommodations that courts developed around hearing-impaired rulers look, in retrospect, less like administrative efficiency and more like workarounds for a condition the court couldn't acknowledge without undermining the ruler's authority. Immune deficiency. The most invisible consequence of royal inbreeding is also, statistically, the most lethal. Inbreeding reduces genetic diversity across the entire genome, including a region called the major histocompatibility complex, which governs how the immune system identifies and responds to pathogens. Lower diversity means the immune system recognizes fewer threats, responds more slowly to novel infections, and fails to mount adequate defenses against pathogens that a genetically diverse immune system would handle without serious illness. In the Spanish Habsburg line, royal childhood mortality in the 17th century was dramatically elevated compared to Spanish commoners of the same period, a counterintuitive result, given that royal children had access to better food, warmer rooms, more medical attention, and protection from the environmental poverty that killed commoner children. The conditions that actually killed royal children, pneumonia, measles, recurring fevers, were infections where immune response quality determined survival. The Romanov children showed patterns of unusual susceptibility to respiratory illness and infection across multiple siblings beyond Alexei's documented hemophilia. Immune deficiency as an inbreeding consequence doesn't appear in portraits or autopsy records. It appears in graveyards, in the extraordinary concentration of small royal coffins in dynasty chapels, in the genealogical trees that terminate with children who died at 2 and 4 and 7 for causes that shouldn't have been fatal. Fertility decline and genetic extinction. Every item on this list is a symptom. This one is the diagnosis. Inbreeding depression, the reduction in biological fitness that accumulates as a genome becomes increasingly homozygous, is one of the most consistently documented phenomena in biology, observed across mammals, birds, plants, and insects, and its endpoint in any sufficiently inbred population is always the same. The population fails to reproduce. For royal dynasties, which organize their entire political existence around the imperative of producing heirs, this biological endpoint was also a political one. The Spanish Habsburg line ended in 1700 when Charles II died without children after 2 marriages. The direct Valois line of France ended similarly. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which practiced sibling marriage as deliberate divine policy for nearly 300 years, produced Cleopatra VII, a ruler of extraordinary individual capability, and then collapsed entirely when she died in 30 BC. The Habsburg inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 for Charles II compares to approximately 0.0045 for Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, who were themselves third cousins, a degree of relation that sounds close until you place it next to 11 generations of uncle-niece marriages. What history records as political failure, dynasties running out of heirs, succession crises, wars fought over empty thrones, is often genetic failure in political clothing. These families didn't lose power because of bad luck or divine disfavor. They engineered their own biological extinction one cousin marriage at a time, prioritizing the purity of bloodlines over the viability of the bodies those bloodlines were supposed to produce. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.